I do not believe in a supernatural God, but the God that I heard Jordan just describe, I do not have any difficulty understanding why he might care if you masturbate, and I also don't have any trouble figuring out how he might answer prayers.
Well, tell me more then.
Well, I can tell you how a prayer might be answered.
Okay, but these are
it's specific, so you could let me do that.
It'll be interesting. So I'm not Jordan. We've not talked about this. If I heard an answer from him that actually would satisfy me as to what the mechanism of action might be, that'd be pretty interesting. And if he can tell me what I heard, I think it would suggest that we're not just making up stories here.
Okay, and you might like this, you maybe not, but it's possible. Okay, so imagine that. Okay, so let's imagine that hellish situation that you laid out. Okay, but let's put the extra twist in it, because one of the things that we both decided, I think, was that you also have to build in the intent into that. So let's say the hell that we're talking about isn't the victim of the terrible massacres that you laid out in the jungle story, but a perpetrator. Okay, so someone who's actually acted in a malevolent manner, truly malevolent manner. Okay, or maybe perhaps we wouldn't have to take that extreme case. We could say, well, perhaps you've decided that, any of you've decided that you've seriously done something wrong, okay, and that you want to get away from hell, you want to make things better. Okay, so here's an exercise you can try. So what you do is you sit on the edge of your bed and you say, okay, what I did was wrong. And you have to really believe this, right? So you've thought about it, it's killing you. It's killing you. So now you're penitent and you're confessing, let's say. And you're confessing to yourself as much as to anyone. And you say, I really want to know what I did wrong. And I really want to know what I could do to put it right. And I'm willing to accept any answer that will manifest itself to me. You try that. See what happens.
Well,
that's a prayer that will be answered, and it won't be answered in the way that you want it to be answered. I can bloody well tell you that.
Okay, but that...
Well, what are you communicating with when you do that?
No, that is something that is a process that I'm familiar with. It doesn't require any supernatural explanation, and it certainly doesn't require that we imagine that any of our books were dictated by the creator of the universe.
I didn't say that it required any supernatural explanation or that it required the book. I was asked to provide an instance of prayer that worked, and that's what I did. I didn't do anything other than that.
That's fully understandable in terms of human psychology. And
it's not understandable because we don't know where the answer comes from.
Well, we don't know where anything comes from.
That's true.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. But that doesn't open the door. I mean, one thing we can know with absolute certainty is that whoever wrote the Bible didn't know either, and there's many other things he or she didn't know, like everything else we know scientifically, right?
It's not so obvious what people know and what they don't know.
No one even knew the brain was involved in any of this, right? So
yeah, but they probably knew about as much as we do about how the brain was involved in it.
But we've already established in some tenuous way that things that nobody understands could have evolved into these stories in some way that would be useful, but nobody knew what they were writing when they wrote it, right?
The problem is that you can, so again, this has been focused through the lens of your attachment to Christianity largely, but Hinduism is a completely different set of stories, right? And many of them, the logic, the emotional logic, the psychological import, many of them have the opposite valence from any Christian story you would tell. The whole notion of, like, for instance, the whole notion of good and evil, right, which has such primacy. I mean, you talk about religion being deeper than ethics because ethics just deals with right and wrong, and religion deals with good and evil, right? At bedrock, okay? Good and evil do not have the same meaning in the East. Buddhism and Hinduism do something very different with good and evil.
I'm willing to accept your definitions of good and evil for the current argument.
The truth is there's just not even evil is just ignorance on some level. It's just that evil is just
You
not,
haven't met any real evil people if you believe that.
Well, okay, so then all the Hindus and Buddhists are wrong about this. That's a possible claim. I'm just saying that there's over 1 billion people who have a religious system of stories from which they derive all kinds of meaning,
Yeah.
to which they're mightily attached, to where we could play the same game of archetypal interpretation and valuing, and yet the cash value with respect to good and evil is irreconcilable with what you get from Christianity.
But it doesn't have to be interoperable, right?
Well, but the point. My point is we live in a reality. Presumably, Hinduism is also useful as a set of heuristics
Has to be.
for Hindus, and if Hinduism, as a matter of doctrine, and as a matter of the interpretations of the heuristics by the devout in both systems, if Hinduism and Christianity are irreconcilable, right, then there must be a deeper level of reality that explains why they both work, that can't be reducible to Christianity being true or Hinduism being true. Right.
Yeah, look, Sam, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that objection. So this is one of the immense problems, obviously, that actually leads down the road to the kind of nihilism that you were objecting to in the moral landscape. It's like one of the things that Nietzsche said that's very much apropos to this, is that, it's one thing to have your belief system shattered by the observation that there are other belief systems that are incommensurate, that seem to have equal utility. So but it's even worse is that once you make the observation that there are other belief systems that have equal utility, then it can shatter your belief in belief systems themselves. And then you're in the postmodern nihilist landscape, and that's a big problem.
Or you could just be in a more fundamental landscape that subsumes both of those belief systems.
That's fine. Let's hope that can happen.
Yeah.
But I would say that's the landscape that I'm trying to pursue. Now, you said that I've been approaching this, say, from a Christian perspective in this dialogue, and to some degree that's true, but there are reasons for that. But I would also say I'm also doing what you recommend doing. Because in Maps of Meaning, for example, because you said, well, what about this problem of multiple interpretations of the text?
You wrote Maps of Meaning.
What's that?
You wrote Maps of Meaning. I wrote the moral landscape.
I'm sorry. I must have missed. Sorry. I must have missed. I misspoke.
That
I'm
was
starting
confusing.
to get tired. But what I tried to do, I tried to address that problem seriously. Like, it's a really big problem. It's the problem of multiple interpretations. It's the postmodern problem. Is that there's an infinite number of potential interpretations. Okay, so so what do we do about that? And the answer is, it's something you allude to, in the moral landscape. And it's part of the basis of your argument why these things need to be grounded in facts. So, because that is part of the answer to the problem of an infinite number of interpretations. In Maps of Meaning, I tried to do what E.O. Wilson recommended, but this was before he wrote his book. I tried to use a consilience approach. So I looked at multiple religious systems. I looked at Christianity. I looked at evolutionary biology. I looked at philosophy. I looked at neuroscience. And I looked at the literature on emotion and motivation and the literature on play that was very nicely delineated by Piaget. And I tried to see where there was a pattern that repeated across all dimensions of evaluation, which is exactly what you do, for example, when you use your 5 senses to detect something real in the world. And that's what Wilson recommended, was a consilience approach. And so my proposition was, if it manifests itself here, and here, and here, and here, and here, 6 places, and it's always the same pattern, then the probability that that pattern exists independent of my delusional interpretation is radically decreased.
Yeah, my claim, however, is that many of these things don't repeat. In fact, they're flipped around completely based on different religious assumptions in different cultures. And again, I would just argue, we can table this for another discussion.
I was trying to dispense with those.
But I'm just saying something as fundamental as evil doesn't run through all these cultures and all these religious traditions.
Then how can you make the claim that everyone would agree with your description of what constitutes bad in the beginning of the moral landscape?
It would be, it's not evil in the sense that there's bad and good. There's better and worse. There's better and worse.
Either universal,
can we
Sam, there's either universal moral intuitions or there aren't.
Yes, no,
which is it?
Yes, no, but
So are some moral intuitions universal?
yes, no, I would think, listen, we are just human beings, right? We're human beings first, before we're Hindu or Buddhist or Christian. I mean, we all get indoctrinated into the religion of our parents. This is an artifice that's laid on top of something far deeper. That should be obvious.
So,
right. We're trying to get down to what's deeper.
Okay, so there may be some moral universals.
Sure, I think.
Okay, Jordan.
Is
it possible that there are some moral intuitions that are highly specific to particular traditions and wouldn't translate over to others?
Yes.
So,
It's highly probable because there would be environment-specific adaptations, like the environment-specific tool use of chimpanzees.
Right.
Right.
Or maybe it's not even the environment. Maybe it's the self-consistency of the belief pattern in question. So
I would put that in the broader environment. It might be a consequence of the particularities of that culture. There would be things that, look, think about it like languages. Like many, and this is kind of an answer to the problem that you laid out, which is a real problem. I'm not trying to deny the problem. If you look at, there's a lot of languages. Lots of languages. Look at how different they are. It's like, yeah, at some levels of analysis, they're fundamentally different. And at other levels of analysis, they're fundamentally the same, which is how we know that they're languages. And you could say, well, there's a very large number of stories. It's like, yes, there are. But the fact that there's enough commonality across the class of stories, the set of all possible stories, so that we can identify what constitutes a story. And I would say that there's enough commonality across the set of all possible good stories that we can say, well, here's a canonical good story, which is, by the way, what you do at the beginning of the moral landscape. Because you say, this is horrible, this is good. We should move from what's horrible to what's good. Say, yes, you've taken a fragment of the universal story and you've made it the axiom of your moral system, which is what you should do. But the claim that I think is not helpful, even though I understand it, is that that's purely a claim of unmediated fact. It's like, no, there is no unmediated fact.
There is, yes. Even facts aren't unmediated facts. I mean, you can't judge something to be factual without presupposing the validity of certain intuitions, like that causes precede events, or causes precede their effects, and those intuitions could be wrong. I mean, we could live in a teleological universe where everything's getting pulled into the future by some kind of attractor, right? And our notion of causation is totally backwards. That remains to be discovered, and we would use other intuitions to make that discovery. But again, you do pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and that there's no branch of science or mathematics or anything fundamental, logic, that can get away from that.
Right. Well, and that's another place.
But given that picture, that doesn't render all intuitions equally respectable.
Absolutely.
Right? Someone
agree.
says, well, I happen to have an intuition that Joseph Smith saw those golden tablets and they were, and Mormonism is true. That's not the sort of intuition we're talking about here. Your intuition doesn't grant you insight into history.
What we could say, and this would be an elaboration of Brett's point, is that moral intuitions of the sort that you're describing have different zones of relevance. So there's some things that would only work as an intuition in very delimited areas of time and space, let's say. There's a hierarchy of moral intuitions, and the more profound the intuition, the more it works as a universal truth across context, just like in a scientific truth. So scientific truth is more profound. This is why the postmodernist readings of Thomas Kuhn are wrong, is that the idea that protons are real is really fundamental, because no matter what span of time and space that you pick, you're going to encounter protons. It works everywhere. And then with moral intuitions, let's say, or moral a prioris, you have the same issue, is some of them are so delimited that they only work here and now. And those are sort of impulsive, low-level intuitions, a whim even. But some of them are really, really deep. The ones, for example, the one that orients you to make the claim that you made in the moral landscape, that the hellish story is bad and the heavenly story is good,
right.
I would say that's one of the deepest, most context-independent moral intuitions, which is kind of the claim you make, except you claim that it's
and again,
a fact.
Back to my fundamental concern here in the difference, with respect to the difference with how we talk about these things, to call that thing God is fine, that's a God I have no problem with, right? But that's not how most people most of the time are using the word, and there's something misleading about that, and that worries me.
Yeah, well, if the claim that you're making is that we're all deeply confused about the nature of divinity and ultimate reality, it's like, yes, clearly.
Well, another thing we agree on.
I also don't disagree. I don't disagree. Look, I've never made the claim that what I'm talking about is like what other people are talking about. I mean, it is in some ways, but I've not made that claim, so I don't see why that's a justifiable criticism. It's like,
well, no, it's a criticism with respect to the very likely effects of communicating in that way. Because I see the results of that communication. It's a little bit, I mean, this is going to sound more invidious than it is, but this is the kind of thing that I get into with Deepak Chopra.
Yeah.
Deepak and I agree about a lot.
I think it's more invidious than it sounds, actually.
Yeah. Well, you're not wearing rhinestone glasses. If you graduate to that, we'll have more of a problem. But Deepak clearly wants to let his audience believe that everything they're into is on some level justifiable by his reading of quantum spookiness, right?
Yeah.
So you know, if you want to go out and just buy a lot of crystals and think they're going to heal you, it has something to do with the quantum nature of reality.
Absolutely nothing like me.
No, but I think Deepak could say, if I got his back to the wall, Deepak could honestly say, listen, I've never said anything about crystals, right? I'm not selling crystals. I've never said they work, but it's the way in which he's failing to make the clear differentiation. The fact that it takes you 20 minutes to admit that a lot of the Bible is filled with barbaric nonsense.
I don't think it took me 20 minutes to admit that.
Well, we'll go to the tape on that.